Here is something I want you to sit with for a second. Every end times video, every sermon, every documentary, they all cover the same handful of signs: wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes, the fig tree, Israel. And look, those are signs. Jesus gave them. They matter. But there is a problem. In Matthew chapter 24 alone, Jesus lists far more than 5 signs. And in Daniel, and in 2 Peter, and in 2 Timothy. There are signs buried in those texts that almost nobody is preaching, not because they are obscure, but because some of them are uncomfortable, some of them are too close to home, and some of them describe things that have only become physically possible in the last few decades. Matthew 24, verse 33. Jesus says, "When you see all these things, know that it is near, right at the door." All these things, not the famous 5. All of them. This video is about the ones most people skip. 7 signs that are either hidden in plain sight, rarely connected to current events, or, and this is the one that keeps me up at night, only possible in our lifetime for the first time in 2,000 years of history. Stay with me through sign 7 especially, because that one has something no other end-time sign has: a measurable finish line. And for the first time in history, we can calculate how close we are to it. But before we get to sign 1, I want to address something directly. Because some of you watching this have been hearing end times teaching your whole lives. You grew up with it. You sat through the sermons. You watched the documentaries. And somewhere along the way, the cumulative weight of predictions that never quite arrived produced a kind of fatigue, a mild numbness, a reflex that hears the words end times and automatically discounts whatever comes next. That response is understandable. And, as we will see in sign 4, it is actually predicted. But here is what I want to ask you to try. Approach these 7 signs not as predictions you are being asked to believe, but as texts you are being asked to read. Actual scripture, cited chapter and verse, paired with actual data from the world we live in right now. Not interpretations you have to accept, evidence you can evaluate. Because the most dangerous response to the signs of the end is not outright rejection. It is the nodding acknowledgement that never changes anything. The person who says, "Yes, I know, I have heard all of this," and then goes back to eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage. Which, as it turns out, is exactly what sign 6 describes. So read this with your eyes actually open. And let's begin. Sign 1. Knowledge will increase. Daniel chapter 12, verse 4. Most end times teaching skips Daniel 12 entirely, and when it does get mentioned, this verse gets read as a positive thing. Knowledge increasing, people traveling, progress, which is why nobody flags it as a warning sign. But read it in context. The angel is speaking to Daniel at the end of the most detailed prophetic timeline in the entire Old Testament. A sequence covering empires, a great tribulation, and the resurrection of the dead. And then, as a parting instruction, the angel says this: "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many will roam to and fro, and knowledge shall increase." The angel is describing the conditions of the time of the end. Frantic movement, and knowledge exploding. Now here is what makes this specific to our generation. Not to Rome, not to the medieval period, not to the Industrial Revolution, but to right now. The architect Buckminster Fuller studied the growth of human knowledge over history and documented what he called the knowledge doubling curve. His research found that until 1900, all of human knowledge doubled approximately once every century. By the end of World War II, it was doubling every 25 years. By the 1980s, every 12 to 13 months. IBM projected that the build-out of the Internet of Things would push that curve toward doubling every 12 hours. 12 hours. For all of human history before the modern era, a person could absorb the sum of their civilization's knowledge over a lifetime. The Renaissance thinker Francis Bacon was described as one of the last people in Europe who could plausibly claim to know everything a person could know, and that was around 1600 AD. 400 years later, every 12 months produces more new information than existed in Bacon's entire world. And now consider the second half of that verse. Many will roam to and fro. The Hebrew word is shoot. It appears in other Old Testament texts to describe restless, anxious movement, scanning, searching, running back and forth without settling, a world of frantic motion and information overload. Does that sound familiar? Does that describe how you spend your morning? This is not a sign of progress. In context, it is a marker, a timestamp. Daniel was told to seal up the prophecy until the time of the end, because only at the time of the end would this condition be visibly, measurably true. We are the first civilization for whom knowledge doubling every year is not a theory, but a documented, observable reality. And no previous generation in history has ever been described by the phrase roaming to and fro in the way our generation is. Daniel saw this coming from 600 BC, and he was told to seal it up because the people of his time would not be able to see what we can see right now. There is something else in that verse that most commentary glosses over. The angel tells Daniel to seal the book, the scroll of prophecy, until the time of the end. This means the verse is self-referencing. It is describing the moment when the seal can finally be broken, when the conditions have been met, when the generation reading it will actually be able to recognize it. Every generation before ours read those words and applied them loosely. Maybe this generation is the one. Maybe this era counts. But no previous generation could look at the phrase, knowledge shall increase, and point to a measurable, documented, empirical curve and say, that is us. That began in our lifetime. That has now reached a scale that no human being from any previous century could have conceived. We are the first, and that specificity matters. Think about what information overload actually does to a person, not in an abstract cultural sense, in your actual daily experience. You wake up. Before you have spoken to another human being, you have processed news, social media, messages, notifications. You have been exposed to more information in the first 20 minutes of your morning than a peasant in medieval England would have encountered in a month. And none of it stops. It runs at you constantly. And the more of it there is, the harder it becomes to sit still long enough to hear anything quiet. Daniel described a world of anxious motion and exploding knowledge. He described it as a sign of the end, not as a triumph of civilization, as a sign. And if you are reading this on a phone or watching this on a screen, you are living inside that sign right now. Sign 2, love growing cold. Matthew chapter 24, verse 12. This one is uncomfortable, and that is probably why it almost never gets preached. Right in the middle of the Olivet Discourse, Jesus' own list of end-time signs, he says this, because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. Most people hear that and assume he is talking about the world going cold, society becoming more callous, which may be true. But look at the Greek word translated most. It is polloi. It means the many, the majority. And in context, Jesus is speaking to his disciples, describing conditions in the community of believers, not just in the general population. He was not saying sinners would become more sinful. He was saying the many inside the faith would experience a cooling of love, not an abandonment of faith, not outright apostasy, a cooling, a gradual drift from genuine love towards something more managed, more performative, more isolated. Now look at the data. In 2023, the United States Surgeon General issued an advisory, the equivalent of a public health warning, declaring loneliness a national epidemic. The advisory found that roughly half of American adults reported measurable loneliness. Among young adults aged 15 to 24, in-person social interaction had dropped by nearly 70% over the previous 2 decades. Church attendance in the United Kingdom, the primary audience for this kind of content, has dropped by roughly half over the last 30 years, not because people became atheists overnight, because the connection slowly cooled. People drifted. The love that once drove them through the door on a Sunday morning became something that could be satisfied more conveniently elsewhere. And here is the thing that Jesus says comes before this cooling, because of the increase of wickedness. Not wickedness in the abstract. The Greek word is anomia, lawlessness, the breakdown of any shared moral framework. When there is no agreed upon standard, love has nothing to organize itself around. Connection requires something held in common. When that shared ground erodes, love does not disappear all at once. It just slowly, imperceptibly cools. This sign is not about the world becoming evil. It is about the church becoming comfortable, professionally organized, digitally connected, and deeply, quietly isolated. There is a word Jesus uses in this verse that is easy to pass over. He says, "The love of most will grow cold. Not will be destroyed. Not will be abandoned. Will grow cold." Cold is not dead. Cold is still present. Cold is still capable of being rekindled. But cold has lost its heat, its urgency. The warmth that once drove action and sacrifice and genuine connection has become something you can be near without feeling. If you have ever sat in a church service and felt nothing, not absence, just nothing, a kind of vague religious neutral, that is what cold looks like. If you have ever said that you believe all the right things and they have produced no actual change in how you live or what you give or who you are willing to be interrupted by, that is what cold looks like. And cold is comfortable. That is the danger. Cold does not feel like a crisis. Hot feels like a crisis. Cold feels like arriving home after a long day and sitting in a chair you know very well. Jesus was not warning the world that it would become cold. He was warning his disciples, and through them, every generation of believers, that among the many, among the majority inside the faith, this cooling would happen as history reached its final chapters. The Surgeon General's report on loneliness described something measurable and documented, but it was describing the external symptom. Jesus was diagnosing the interior condition underneath it. Jesus named this 2,000 years before the Surgeon General did. Sign 3. Perilous Times. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. This is the sign that reads like a news headline. But here is what most people miss when they hear it. Paul is not describing what the world will look like in the last days. He is describing what the church will look like. Read the context. Paul is writing to Timothy, a young pastor leading a church. He is warning him about people inside the community of faith, not pagans outside it. He says, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come." And then he gives a list of 18 specific characteristics, not general trends, 18 concrete descriptions. So let's go through them. Because when you read them one by one and ask honestly who this describes, the answer is not comfortable. Lovers of themselves. We live in the age of personal branding, the selfie, the relentless curation of a public image. Self-love is now actively taught as the foundation of mental health. Lovers of money. The prosperity gospel, the theology that frames wealth as God's reward for faith, is now one of the fastest growing expressions of Christianity on earth. Churches that teach this are drawing tens of thousands weekly. Boastful, proud. Social media is structurally designed to reward boasting. Every platform is built around the performance of a life, not the living of one. Disobedient to parents. Generational authority has collapsed in a single generation. The assumption that age carries wisdom has been replaced by a culture where the oldest generation is routinely mocked as outdated and irrelevant. Ungrateful. Studies on gratitude consistently show that despite living in the wealthiest, most comfortable societies in human history, reported satisfaction has not increased. Entitlement has. Without self-control, addiction to substances, to screens, to gambling, to pornography, is now an acknowledged public health crisis across every demographic in the Western world. Brutal. The internet has given ordinary people a mechanism to inflict cruelty on others at scale with no consequences. Online harassment is documented, common, and largely normalized, not lovers of the good. Studies of digital engagement consistently show that outrage, conflict, and bad news generate dramatically more engagement than good news. The incentive structure of every major platform is designed around this, having a form of godliness but denying its power. This is the one that should stop every church-going person cold. Paul is describing people who maintain the structure, the language, the cultural identity of faith, the form of godliness, while the actual power of transformation, repentance, and encounter with God is absent. This is not describing atheists. Paul explicitly says, have nothing to do with such people. These are people you can have something to do with. People in the building, people using the language, people attending, people who have reduced faith to an identity marker rather than a living reality. Paul wrote this in approximately 67 AD. He was not describing the Roman Empire. He was writing a warning to a young pastor about what to watch for inside the church as history moved toward its conclusion. Read that list again, and count how many of those 18 characteristics describe not the world outside your church, but the world inside it, and then sit with this. Paul wrote 2 Timothy from a prison cell in Rome, knowing he was about to be executed. He was not writing a cultural commentary on Roman society. He was writing a pastoral letter to a young man responsible for a specific congregation. He was trying to prepare that young pastor for what he was going to encounter inside the community of faith as history moved toward its conclusion. That is the context. These 18 characteristics were written as an interior warning, a diagnostic for the health of the church at the end of history. And the 18th one, the last one, the one that functions as the summary, is the one that captures everything, having a form of godliness but denying its power, a form, an external shape, the appearance of the thing without the thing itself, the structure without the substance, the language without the transformation. And here is what makes this particularly precise. Paul does not describe people who have rejected Christianity. He describes people who have maintained the form of it, who would identify as Christians, who attend services, who know the vocabulary, who participate in the cultural community, but for whom the actual power, the life-altering, character-transforming, genuinely supernatural reality is absent, not rejected, just quietly, gradually absent. This is not a description of hypocrisy in the obvious sense. It is a description of drift, of the slow replacement of living relationship with institutional habit, of religion that costs nothing and changes nothing and produces nothing. Paul told Timothy to have nothing to do with such people. That instruction only makes sense if these people are in the community, if they are already inside, if the form they are maintaining looks, from the outside, enough like the real thing that distinguishing between the two requires discernment. This is what Paul said the church would look like at the end, not abandoned, not overtly corrupt, formally present, substantively hollow. 3 signs down, and I want to tell you something about the next 4, because signs 1 through 3 are things you can observe in the culture around you. You can see them, you can measure them. They are real. But signs 4 through 7 are different. They are the ones where the text itself does something unusual. Sign 4 is a sign about the people who will deny the signs. Sign 5 describes something that was considered physically impossible for 1900 years and has only become real in the last 2 decades. Sign 6 describes the condition of ordinary life just before the end, and why that condition is itself the warning. And sign 7 is the only sign in the entire Bible with a calculable finish line. So stay with me, because this is where it gets genuinely interesting. Sign 4, scoffers will come. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. This is the sign that predicts its own rejection. And the logic of it is remarkable. Peter writes, "Most importantly, you must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, 'Where is the promise of his coming?' Ever since our ancestors died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation." Read that carefully. Peter is not just warning that some people will mock the idea of Christ's return. He is describing the specific argument they will use. And the argument is this: nothing has changed. The world keeps going on as it always has. There are no signs. There is no countdown. Pastors have been saying the end is near for 2,000 years, and here we are. It is the same tired prediction that never comes true. If you spend any time in the comment sections of End Times content, you have seen this argument verbatim, not a paraphrase. The exact argument, word for word. And here is what makes this sign different from all the others. The other signs describe conditions that will exist. This sign describes a response to the signs, specifically the response of dismissal, of skepticism, of intellectual superiority about the very possibility that we might be approaching something. In other words, the mockery of end times teaching is itself a predicted end time sign. The people who say nothing Peter predicted has happened are, by saying it, fulfilling what Peter predicted. Peter then does something that most casual readers miss. He addresses the argument directly. In verse 5, he says that people who make this argument are deliberately choosing to overlook something. They are not mistaken. They are willfully ignoring the evidence. And the evidence he points to is this: God has already intervened dramatically in history before. The flood of Noah was not a minor event. It was a global restructuring of the conditions of life on earth. The same God who did that once, Peter says, has promised to act again. The patience of God is not evidence that he is absent. It is evidence that he is waiting and not wanting anyone to perish, but giving time for repentance. The scoffer's argument, nothing has changed, therefore nothing will change, is the exact argument that people in Noah's day could have made as the rain began to fall. Nothing unusual has ever happened before. And then everything changed. And here is the part of 2 Peter 3 that almost never gets quoted alongside verses 3 and 4. In verse 9, Peter explains the apparent delay. He writes, "The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance." The patience of God is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of mercy. The fact that 2,000 years have passed since Jesus spoke those words in Matthew 24 is not proof that nothing is coming. It is evidence that the God who controls the timeline is extending it for the sake of every person who has not yet had the opportunity to respond. Peter then adds something else in verse 10 that the scoffers always leave out of their argument. He writes, "But the day of the Lord will come like a thief." The silence is not absence. The thief does not announce his arrival. The quiet is not reassurance. And then Peter does something unexpected. He turns the argument around. Instead of defending the timing, he asks a different question entirely. He writes in verse 11, "Since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought you to be? Not when will it happen? What kind of person should you be while you wait?" That is the actual response Peter is pointing toward. Not obsessive calculation of the date, not dismissal, not passive observation. A question about character, about how you live in the gap between the promise and its fulfillment, about whether the reality of what is coming has produced any actual change in who you are. That is what Peter says the right response to end times teaching looks like. Not fear, not speculation. Character. Sign 5. The infrastructure. Revelation chapter 13, verses 16 and 17. I want to be very clear about what I am and am not saying here, because this sign is genuinely explosive and it is also genuinely easy to get wrong. What I am not saying, I am not claiming to know what the mark of the beast is. I am not making predictions about specific technologies or governments or individuals. I'm not connecting any current product, service, or political figure to the Antichrist. What I am saying is this. For 1900 years, a specific verse in the book of Revelation described something that was simply not possible. Revelation 13, verses 16 and 17. John writes, "He also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark." Read that from the perspective of any reader before the 21st century. A single system, globally enforced, that controls whether every individual person on Earth can participate in economic life. No exemptions based on wealth or status, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave. A universal, trackable, controllable economic system. That was science fiction. It was not just unlikely, it was physically impossible. The infrastructure did not exist and could not have existed. Now consider the current moment. As of 2024, 134 countries representing 98% of global economic output are actively researching, developing, or piloting central bank digital currencies. CBDCs. Government-issued digital money, programmable and fully trackable. 3 countries, the Bahamas, Jamaica, and Nigeria, have already launched national CBDCs. China's digital yuan has processed nearly $1 trillion in transactions. The European Central Bank is in active preparation for a digital euro. In May of 2020, only 35 countries were exploring CBDCs. By 2024, that number had quadrupled. Alongside this, digital identity infrastructure is being built globally. The EU Digital Identity Wallet. National digital ID systems across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Biometric payment systems. Systems that link identity to financial access are not theoretical. They are being tested and deployed right now. Here is the point. And this is the only point I am making. For 1900 years, theologians read Revelation 13 and did not know what to do with it. Some said it was symbolic. Some said it had already been fulfilled in the Roman Empire. Some simply noted it and moved on because the described system was impossible in their world. It is not impossible in ours. John wrote in approximately 96 AD that every human being on Earth would need a mark to buy or sell. The idea of a global, real-time, programmable economic control system arrived in our lifetime, not in the past, not in a future we cannot see. Now, in the last decade, whether any specific CBDC or digital ID system becomes what Revelation describes, I do not know. No one does. But the infrastructure that would make it possible has never existed before, and now it does. That is the sign, not the specific fulfillment, the existence for the first time of the possibility. And the speed of development here is worth naming clearly. In May of 2020, 35 countries were exploring CBDCs. By 2024, that number had become 134, a nearly 4-fold increase in 4 years. That is not gradual progress. That is acceleration. The kind of acceleration that happens when a technology crosses a threshold and goes from experimental to infrastructural. And the infrastructural point is the important one. CBDCs are not simply a new payment method. They are programmable money, meaning the issuing authority can, in principle, build conditions directly into the currency. They can program the currency to expire after a certain date. They can restrict what it can be spent on. They can link it to behavioral conditions. Whether any government would do these things is a separate question. The important point is that the architecture now allows for it in a way that no previous monetary system ever has. Add to that the development of digital identity infrastructure, the EU Digital Identity Wallet, biometric enrollment programs in India and across sub-Saharan Africa, the linkage of financial access to verified identity across dozens of national systems, and you have the structural components of what Revelation 13 describes beginning to assemble in real time. Again, I'm not saying any of this is the mark. I'm saying that for 1900 years of Christian history, the verse describing a global buy and sell control system was read as either symbolic or as a reference to something already past. It could not be read as literally possible because the technology did not exist. It now exists. That shift happened in our lifetime. No theologian in any previous century could have said that sentence. When Revelation was written, the most advanced economic system on earth was the Roman denarius. And even that could not have been weaponized globally in real time. John wrote what he saw. And what he saw did not become possible until now. Sign 6. As in the days of Noah, Matthew chapter 24, verses 37 through 39. This one is almost always misread, and the misreading causes people to miss the actual warning. Jesus says, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away." Most people read that and think Jesus is describing immorality. They pull in Genesis 6 with the wickedness and the Nephilim, and they build a whole framework of social collapse. But that is not what Jesus actually says here. Look at what he describes: eating, drinking, marrying, normal life. The sign is not that the world before the end will be uniquely wicked. The sign is that the world before the end will be utterly normal, that life will be going on as expected, that nothing on the surface will appear to have changed, that people will be so absorbed in the ordinary rhythms of existence that the approach of something catastrophic will not register until it arrives. They knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came, not because they lacked information. Noah had been building an ark for years. He had been preaching. The warning was available. They simply did not integrate it into how they lived, because normal life kept going, and the threat never seemed immediate enough to act on. This is the sign of normality as distraction, of busyness as a spiritual condition. And this is where it becomes personal. Because the question this sign asks is not about what is happening in the world. It is about what is happening in you. It is asking whether the proximity of what is coming, the signs accumulating around you, the infrastructure building, the prophecies filling in, has changed anything about how you are actually living, or whether you are eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage, going through the days, aware in the abstract that something might be approaching, but not yet in a place where that awareness has produced anything real. The people in Noah's day had access to the same information he had. They chose not to let it land. Jesus is warning that the generation of the end will do the same thing. The question is whether that warning is landing for you right now. Sign 7. The Gospel to all nations. Matthew chapter 24, verse 14. This is the one I said has a finish line, and I meant it. Jesus says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." Then the end will come, not before. Then, every other sign Jesus gives is a condition, something that will exist, something you will observe, but this sign is a trigger, a completion event. When a specific thing is finished, when the gospel has reached every nation as a testimony, then the end will come. And the extraordinary thing about this sign is that for the first time in 2,000 years, we can actually measure progress toward its completion. The Greek word translated nations is ethnos, from which we get the English word ethnic. Jesus is not talking about political nation-states. He is talking about people groups, communities defined by shared language, culture, and identity. The Joshua Project, which tracks global missionary progress, currently identifies approximately 17,000 distinct people groups worldwide. Of those, according to current data, roughly 7,400 are considered unreached, meaning they have no indigenous church and no access to the gospel in a form they can understand in their own language. Wycliffe Bible Translators reports that, as of recent years, there are approximately 350 million people who still have no scripture in their heart language. For most of Christian history, that number was in the billions. It has come down enormously, but it has not reached zero. Now add the technology dimension. AI translation tools are accelerating Bible translation at a rate that was unimaginable 10 years ago. Organizations that previously took decades to translate a single New Testament are now working on timelines measured in years. This is the only end-time sign with a measurable gap between where we are and where the sign says we need to be. Every other sign is a condition. You observe it, you note it, but you cannot calculate how close you are to the end based on it alone. This sign has a finish line that you can actually track. And for the first time in 2,000 years, through a combination of missionary acceleration, AI translation, digital distribution, and the collapse of the communication barriers that kept certain people groups isolated, we are closer to that finish line than any previous generation has ever been. That is not speculation. That is a measurable, documented, trackable fact. So, 7 signs. Let's name them together. And before I do, one more thing, because I think it matters for how you receive what comes next. Every sign I am about to summarize has a chapter and a verse. Every data point I cited has a verifiable source. I did not go looking for dramatic claims and then find scriptures to prop them up. I went to the text, found what is actually there, and then looked for the modern evidence. That discipline matters, because there is a lot of end times content that runs in the opposite direction, starting with dramatic current events and working backward to find supporting verses. That approach produces heat without light. It produces urgency without grounding, and the people consuming it come away energized but not actually anchored. What I want you to walk away with is different. I want you to walk away with the text in your hand and the data in your mind and the ability to check both yourself. Because the truth of what the Bible says does not need to be oversold. It just needs to be seen clearly. So, 7 signs. Let's name them together. Daniel 12:4, knowledge increasing at a rate that was impossible in every previous era of human history, now measurably true and accelerating. Matthew 24:12, love growing cold, not in the world, but in the many, in the community of faith, in a generation more digitally connected and more deeply isolated than any before it. 2 Timothy 3:1-5, 18 specific characteristics of people who have the form of godliness but not its power, written to a pastor as a warning about what his congregation would look like at the end of history. 2 Peter 3:3-4, scoffers, who use the argument that nothing has changed as proof that nothing will. A sign that is self-negating. The mockery of the signs is itself a sign. Revelation 13:16-17, the infrastructure for a global economic control system physically impossible for 1900 years, now built and accelerating. Matthew 24:37-39, the sign of normality as distraction, people eating, drinking, marrying, life going on as expected, right up to the moment it changes. Matthew 24:14, the one sign with a measurable finish line, the gospel to all nations. A gap that can be tracked, that is demonstrably narrowing, and that when it closes marks the completion of the last remaining condition Jesus himself named. Now, what do you do with this? Because the wrong response to all of this is fear. That is not what these signs are for. In Luke 21, verse 28, which is Luke's account of the same Olivet discourse, Jesus says something remarkable. He says, when these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Stand up. Lift your head. Not because what is coming is terrifying, because what is coming is your redemption. These signs are not a threat to the person who belongs to Jesus. They are a promise. They are the mile markers on a road that leads somewhere specific. Every sign that fills in is not evidence that things are getting worse. It is evidence that the story is moving towards its conclusion, but there is a right response. And it is not passive. The days of Noah warning is there for a reason. The people who were absorbed in ordinary life did not survive the flood, not because they were evil, because they never acted on what they knew. The warning was available. The ark was sitting there. They simply never crossed the distance between information and decision. If what you have heard today has opened something up, if you're seeing connections you had not made before, do not let that evaporate into the next ordinary thing you do today. Take 5 minutes. Ask yourself honestly, have these signs changed anything about how I'm living? Have they produced any action, any urgency, any different way of holding what matters? Because that is the question the days of Noah sign is asking, not whether you know, whether knowing has changed anything. There is a detail in the Genesis account of Noah that Jesus does not include in his summary, but that adds important texture. The text says Noah was a preacher of righteousness. This is referenced in 2 Peter 2:5. He was not quietly building a boat in secret. He was warning people for years, possibly decades. The people who died in the flood had heard the warning. They had seen the evidence. They had access to the information. But the ordinary rhythms of life, eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, were more immediately real to them than any coming event they could not see. This is the spiritual condition Jesus names as the defining characteristic of the last generation before the end. Not dramatic wickedness, not obvious rebellion, just the slow, steady absorption of ordinary life as the primary reality. The implications of that for anyone watching a video like this one are obvious. You are receiving information right now. You're hearing signs named, scriptures cited, data pointed to. And in approximately 15 minutes from now, you will go back to eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage, to the ordinary rhythms of your ordinary day. The question Jesus is asking is not whether you will have heard this. The question is whether hearing it will produce any difference, any reorientation, any action. Because the people of Noah's day heard it too, and they went back to normal life. And they were there, in the middle of normal life, when the rain started. If this has connected something for you, if you have seen something today you had not seen before, share this with one person. Not because we need the views, because these 7 signs are verifiable, scriptural, and directly applicable to the world we're living in right now. And the people around you deserve to have access to this conversation. Subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next, because there are places in the biblical text, the Ethiopian Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the book of Daniel in its full context, where the story goes deeper than most people have ever been taken. We're going there. But before we close, let me stay with sign 7 for one more moment, because I think it deserves it. Matthew 24:14 says that when this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a testimony to all nations, then the end will come. Most end times teaching treats this sign the same way it treats the others, as a condition to observe, not a task to participate in. But that is not how Jesus framed it. He framed it as something that will be done, something that will be completed. And the natural implication is that it will be completed by people, by the community of believers who take it seriously, which means this is the only end-time sign that you can actually do something about. You cannot accelerate the development of central bank digital currencies. You cannot slow the rate of knowledge doubling. You cannot reverse the loneliness epidemic by yourself. Most of the signs are things you observe and respond to internally, but the completion of the gospel to all nations, that is something the church participates in actively. And the fact that the gap between where we are and where the sign says we need to be is measurable and narrowing. That is not just encouraging data, it is an invitation. The generation that closes that gap will be the generation that triggers what Matthew 24:14 promises. Then the end will come. Think about that. This is not passive observation. This is participation in the final chapter of a story God has been telling for thousands of years. And the finish line, for the first time in 2,000 years, is within sight. That is not a reason for fear. That is a reason to lift your head. One final thought, and then we are done. The 7 signs we covered tonight are not arbitrary. They are not a compilation of dramatic passages strung together for effect. They're a coherent picture of a specific set of conditions. Conditions that converge. Knowledge exploding beyond the capacity of any individual to absorb. Love cooling in the very communities that should be its most reliable source. A detailed list of character traits marking the church at the end. A self-fulfilling sign that predicts its own mockery. A global economic infrastructure assembling for the first time in history. A condition of normality so complete that it functions as blindness. An immeasurable finish line approaching faster than any generation has ever seen it approach. These signs are not warnings to the world. They are information for the people who are paying attention. Jesus said in Luke 21:28, "When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." Not fear, not panic, not obsessive calculation of the date. Stand up, lift your head. Because what these signs are telling you is not that everything is falling apart. They're telling you that everything is falling into place. The story that God has been telling for thousands of years, through the prophets, through the Hebrew calendar, through the apostles and the church, is moving toward its conclusion. And the conclusion is not darkness. The conclusion is redemption. You are alive in the generation where the finish line is becoming visible. That is not a burden. It is a privilege. Live like it.